A policeman who liked to show off his strength saw a man sitting quietly in a park. He decided that he was a slacker who had no right to be there, and decided to show him who was in charge. He grabbed him, swung his baton, and at that moment made the biggest mistake of his life. A few seconds later, the officer realized that he had the wrong man. Now his career is over, and you will remember this day forever. The sun hung high over the sprawling expanse of Griffith Park, casting warm, golden light over the trees and winding pathways. The air carried the mingling scents of freshly cut grass and distant food stalls selling roasted nuts and hot dogs. Children's laughter filled the open space, as families spread blankets over the grass and joggers passed by in steady rhythms, their sneakers tapping against the paved trails. The world moved at its usual pace, people lost in their own little moments, unaware that today, something extraordinary was about to unfold. In the midst of this everyday scene sat a man alone on a wooden bench beneath the shade of a large sycamore tree. He appeared unbothered by the chaos of life swirling around him, a figure of stillness and quiet contemplation. The man was dressed simply, faded blue jeans, a snug black t-shirt stretched over his broad shoulders, and worn-out boots planted firmly on the ground. His silver hair was neatly combed back, but a few rebellious strands refused to stay in place. His chiseled features were unmistakable, angular jawline, piercing eyes that carried the weight of years, and a face weathered not by time alone, but by experiences most could never fathom. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat there, unmoving, his massive hands slowly sprinkling birdseed onto the pavement at his feet. A flock of pigeons gathered around him, pecking eagerly at the offering, oblivious to the legendary status of the man who fed them. Despite being one of the most recognizable figures in the world, in this moment, he was just another visitor enjoying the tranquility of the park. He had spent a lifetime in motion, training, fighting, winning, governing. Now he simply sat, letting the minutes pass in peace. But peace, as fate would have it, was not destined to last. A pair of heavy boots crunched against the pavement, the steps deliberate and slow, exuding a sense of authority. The approaching figure was a tall, broad-shouldered man, clad in a meticulously pressed police uniform. His badge gleamed under the sunlight, and his mirrored sunglasses concealed his sharp, calculating gaze. His utility belt, perfectly arranged with a baton, handcuffs, radio, and a standard-issue firearm, rested comfortably on his hips. He walked like a man who expected to be feared. Officer Dan Cross was not known for his kindness. He had built his reputation on force and compliance. In his mind, the law wasn't just something to be enforced. It was something to be imposed. And today, as he patrolled the park, his gaze landed on the solitary man feeding pigeons. Something about the scene irritated him. Cross had encountered men like this before, old, silent, and arrogant. They always thought they were above authority, that their years of experience gave them some unearned exemption from the rules. He detested their kind. There was no reason for a man to sit so still in a park for this long, unless he was up to something. To Cross, this was a challenge, a silent defiance that needed to be corrected. Without hesitation, he veered off the main path, making a direct beeline for the bench. His footsteps became louder, purposeful. A few passers-by took notice. Some joggers slowed their pace, sensing the unspoken tension. A woman walking her dog gave a cautious glance before hurrying away. A group of teenagers by a picnic table exchanged knowing looks. They had seen Cross in action before. The officer came to a halt directly in front of the bench, his shadow falling over Arnold. He planted his feet wide, his hands resting on his belt, radiating an energy that all but screamed his intentions. He was the authority here. But Arnold didn't move. The pigeons continued their feeding, unconcerned by the looming presence of the officer. The only thing that changed was the subtle shift in the air, something unspoken, something unmeasurable, but undeniable. Cross cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive against the peaceful park ambience. "You got some business here, old man?" His voice was edged with impatience. Arnold continued his slow, deliberate movement, dropping another handful of birdseed onto the pavement. Cross's nostrils flared. He didn't like being ignored. "You hear me?" he said, louder this time, his fingers tightening around the baton at his side. "I asked you a question." Still, Arnold didn't respond, nor did he look up. His posture remained relaxed, but to those paying close attention, something about him was unervingly composed, as if he had already assessed the entire situation and dismissed it as insignificant. A flicker of frustration crossed the officer's face. People usually reacted when he spoke. They stammered, they rushed to explain themselves, they complied. This man? This man wasn't reacting at all. Cross took a step closer, the polished tip of his boot stopping just inches from Arnold's own. The power dynamic had shifted, though the officer didn't yet realize it. His hand twitched toward his baton, his patience thinning with every second of silence. "I need to see some ID," he ordered, voice clipped and commanding. For the first time, Arnold moved, but only slightly. He lifted his chin, just enough for the brim of his hat to reveal the full strength of his gaze. His blue eyes, calm yet piercing, locked onto the officer's face, studying him, weighing him. The moment stretched thin, the air around them thick with an unspoken intensity. Cross felt something unexpected, something close to doubt, but he buried it quickly beneath his usual bravado. "I don't have all day," he snapped. Arnold's lips curled ever so slightly. Not a smile, not quite amusement, but something in between. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. "I'm just feeding the birds." Cross clenched his jaw. He didn't like the way that sounded. Too calm, too sure. He had meant to establish dominance, to make it clear that he was in charge. Instead, he was the one who felt like he was standing on unsteady ground. A bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck. He clenched his fingers, feeling the reassuring weight of his baton. His training dictated what came next. When words didn't work, action did. He would escalate, make this old man understand who held the power here. He didn't yet realize that the moment he reached for his baton, his fate was sealed. The sun continued to shine, the pigeons continued to peck at the seeds, and life in the park moved on. But within this small pocket of space, an entirely different storm was brewing, one that Officer Dan Cross would never forget. Officer Dan Cross tightened his grip on the baton, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hand. He had dealt with plenty of difficult individuals in his career, drunks, troublemakers, people who thought they were above the law. This old man, sitting there like he owned the park, was no different. He was just another relic who thought he could defy authority. Cross wasn't about to let that happen. The tension in the air thickened. The warm breeze rustled the trees, but the world around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two men locked in an unspoken standoff. A few people in the park had taken notice now. Some had slowed their steps, their conversations tapering off as they sensed something was about to happen. A young couple nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A jogger paused to take a sip from her water bottle, her eyes darting between the officer and the man on the bench. Arnold Schwarzenegger remained motionless. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. He was no stranger to men like Cross, men who mistook a badge for power, who believed that authority was something to be forced upon others rather than earned. Arnold had seen them before in different places and different roles. He knew their type, and he knew exactly how this was going to unfold. Cross took another step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. His patience had run out. "You think this is funny, old man?" he growled. "I gave you an order. ID now." Arnold slowly tilted his head, his expression calm but firm. "I told you," he said in a voice so low and even it almost felt dangerous. "I'm just feeding the birds." That was it. Cross's jaw clenched. He was done playing games. With a swift motion, he lifted his baton, the polished wood catching the sunlight as he prepared to make an example out of this defiant stranger. But before the baton could descend, Arnold moved. It was a blur of motion, so fast, so precise that Cross barely registered what was happening. One moment he was in control, the next his wrist was caught in a grip that felt like iron. He gasped in surprise as Arnold's fingers closed around his wrist, the pressure firm but not painful. The baton was still in his hand, but he suddenly felt like a child holding a toy. The park seemed to hold its breath. Arnold's grip didn't tighten, didn't jerk. He simply held the officer's wrist in place, as if testing its weight, its resistance. His eyes remained locked on Cross's unwavering calm. And in that moment, something terrifyingly real settled over the officer. He had picked the wrong fight. Cross's instinct was to pull away, but the pressure on his wrist was immovable. The control he had so effortlessly wielded over others his entire career was now slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to reclaim it. Arnold finally spoke, his voice just as calm as before, but now carrying an undeniable authority. "You don't want to do this, officer." Cross gritted his teeth. He couldn't back down now. He had a crowd watching. His pride was at stake. He wrenched his arm back, or at least he tried. Arnold's grip didn't falter. If anything, the attempt only served to solidify the unspoken reality. Cross was no longer in control. The officer's face reddened with anger, but beneath there was something else. Something he wouldn't admit. Fear. Arnold, still holding his wrist, finally released him. But the damage had already been done. Cross staggered back a step, his breath uneven. The baton slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground between them. It felt deafening in the silence that had settled over the park. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Someone whispered something. Another person raised their phone. Cross's mind was racing. His pulse thundered in his ears. His whole career had been built on control, on fear, on making sure people never dared to challenge him. But now, standing before this man, stripped of his authority in the span of seconds, he felt exposed. But he wasn't done yet. With a sharp inhale, he took a step back, his fingers twitching toward his belt. The weight of his gun was reassuring, his final line of defense. If this old man thought he could embarrass him, he was sorely mistaken. Cross's pride wouldn't allow him to walk away like this. Arnold saw the shift in his stance before the officer even moved. The subtle tilt of his shoulders, the way his fingers tensed just above his holster. It was all the warning he needed. The moment Cross reached for his weapon, Arnold was already moving. This time, there was no hesitation, no measured grip, no warning. Before Cross could even wrap his fingers around the handle of his gun, his wrist was caught again, this time with unyielding force. His body turned involuntarily, his balance thrown. He gasped as his arm was twisted just enough to make him lose control. And in one smooth motion, the gun was gone. Arnold now held it, not with menace, not with intent to use it, but with the effortless ease of someone who had just removed a dangerous tool from the hands of someone too reckless to wield it. Cross stood there, frozen, the realization crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. The weight of what had just happened, what he had just lost, settled deep in his bones. Arnold held the gun for only a moment before he bent down, carefully placing it on the ground next to the fallen baton. Then slowly he straightened and met the officer's gaze. "It's over," he said simply. The world around them seemed to start moving again. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Someone gasped. A voice muttered a curse under their breath. More phones were raised. Cross swallowed, his throat dry. His entire body screamed at him to do something, to salvage what little dignity he had left. But what could he do? He had been outmatched, outmaneuvered, and worst of all, humiliated in front of an audience. He wasn't in control anymore. Arnold gave him a long, measured look. Then, as if deciding the matter was settled, he turned away. He returned to the bench, sat down, and picked up the bag of birdseed once more. Without another word, he began feeding the pigeons again, as if nothing had happened. Cross stared at him, unable to move, unable to process how everything had gone so wrong. The sound of approaching footsteps cut through the moment. More officers, drawn by the commotion, were making their way over. One of them, an older man with graying hair and weary eyes, recognized Arnold almost immediately. His face paled, his steps slowed, and then, just as quickly, his expression hardened as he turned to Cross. "Dan," he said, his voice firm, "give me your badge." The park was silent. Cross's world crumbled around him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Officer Dan Cross felt the weight of every eye in the park on him, their gazes burning into his uniform like scorching iron. His mouth was dry, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The words of his superiors still rang in his ears. "Done? Give me your badge." Cross wanted to protest, wanted to argue, but he knew there was no way out. His authority had already been stripped, his control shattered. He had made a mistake. No, he had made the biggest mistake of his career. And now, the consequences were crashing down on him like an avalanche. Slowly, stiffly, as if every movement was a blow to his pride, he reached up and unpinned the gleaming badge from his chest. He hesitated for just a second, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, the symbol of power he had once wielded so effortlessly. And then, with a sharp exhale, he placed it in the outstretched palm of his commanding officer. The older officer, Sergeant Reynolds, looked at the badge with a solemn expression. His fingers closed around it, and with that single motion, Dan Cross ceased to be a cop. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people shook their heads. Others muttered amongst themselves. A few had their phones up, recording every second of Cross's downfall. He wanted to snatch them away, to erase the evidence, to make it all disappear. But there was no undoing this. Reynolds sighed, tucking the badge into his pocket. "You're done, Cross. Go home." Home. The words sounded foreign, meaningless. Cross wasn't sure where home even was anymore. The uniform had been his identity, his purpose. Without it, what was left of him? He took a step back, his legs heavy, his chest tightening with shame. He glanced at Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had returned to feeding the pigeons, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if none of this had ever mattered. Cross wanted to hate him, wanted to see him as the villain in all of this, but deep down, he knew the truth. Arnold hadn't done anything. He had just been there, sitting on that damn bench, when Cross had decided to turn a routine patrol into a power trip. The fault lay entirely with him. Cross turned on his heel and walked away, his boots scuffing against the pavement. No one stopped him. No one said a word. It was as if he had already ceased to exist. The crowd began to disperse, the energy of the confrontation fading into whispers and lingering glances. The world moved on, leaving Dan Cross behind. Arnold sat in the fading light of the afternoon, the last remnants of birdseed spilling from his fingers as the pigeons fluttered around his feet. He had seen this type of thing before, far too many times. Power had a way of corrupting men who didn't know how to wield it properly, but the world had a way of humbling them in return. He didn't feel anger toward Cross. He didn't even feel satisfaction. There was nothing to gloat over. A man had simply learned a lesson, one he would either grow from or let destroy him. The bench creaked slightly as someone sat down beside him. Arnold didn't turn, didn't need to. The scent of leather and coffee told him enough. "You never change," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head with a small chuckle. Arnold smirked slightly. "Neither do they." Reynolds sighed. "You could have let him off easy. He wouldn't have learned." The sergeant ran a hand down his face, rubbing his temple. "You scare the hell out of people, you know that?" Arnold finally turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze meeting Reynolds's. "Only the ones who deserve it." The older man snorted, shaking his head. "You ever think about coming back? We could use someone like you." Arnold chuckled, tossing the empty birdseed bag into a nearby trash can. "I left that life behind, Reynolds." The sergeant exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, well, that life doesn't seem to want to leave you." Arnold didn't respond. He simply sat there, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the buildings in the distance. Reynolds stood up, brushing off his uniform. "Try not to dismantle any more officers, all right?" "No promises," Arnold said with a smirk. Reynolds chuckled and walked away, leaving Arnold alone once more. The pigeons cooed, the park hummed with life, and Arnold Schwarzenegger sat back, waiting for the next storm to come his way. The park had returned to its usual rhythm. Children laughing, joggers pacing the winding paths, birds fluttering in search of scattered crumbs. The incident that had unfolded between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Officer Dan Cross was already fading into memory for most of the bystanders. But for Arnold, the moment lingered, not as an event of triumph or satisfaction, but as yet another example of how power, when wielded irresponsibly, could backfire spectacularly. Arnold leaned back on the wooden bench, feeling the aged would press against his broad shoulders. He had always found parks to be a refuge, a place to think, to reflect, to simply exist without the demands of the world pressing down on him. Today, however, he felt the weight of something more substantial, the awareness that no matter how much he tried to fade into the background, there would always be people like Cross looking to make a statement at the expense of others. He sighed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, weathered notepad. The pages were filled with scribbles, sketches, and ideas, reminders of thoughts that had come and gone. As he flipped through it absent-mindedly, his sharp ears caught the sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, familiar. "Mind if I sit?" a deep voice asked. Arnold turned slightly, recognizing the man immediately. Sergeant Reynolds stood there, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but there was no hostility in his gaze either, only curiosity, and perhaps a trace of resignation. "Free country," Arnold said, gesturing toward the empty space beside him. Reynolds lowered himself onto the bench, letting out a grunt as he adjusted his belt. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, watching the park move around them. A dog barked in the distance. A child squealed with laughter as he chased after a balloon. The world carried on, indifferent to the confrontation that had just taken place. Finally, Reynolds spoke. "You made quite a scene back there." Arnold smirked. "Didn't mean to." Reynolds scoffed. "Yeah? You sure about that?" Arnold didn't answer right away. He let the question settle, weighing his response carefully. "I didn't start it," he finally said, "but I wasn't going to let him get away with it either." Reynolds nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He ran a hand down his face, his fingers briefly rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You know, Cross wasn't always like that." Arnold raised an eyebrow. "No." Reynolds shook his head. "Started out with good intentions. Wanted to help people. But somewhere along the way, he let the badge become his identity instead of his responsibility. He forgot that power isn't about control. It's about service." Arnold exhaled through his nose. He had seen it before. Men who joined the force, the military, the government, even Hollywood, thinking they would make a difference, only to lose themselves in the very thing they swore to protect. "So what happens now?" Arnold asked. Reynolds let out a slow breath. "Officially, Cross is suspended pending review. Unofficially, he's done. There's no coming back from something like this. Not in today's world." Arnold nodded, absorbing the information. It wasn't surprising. Cross had crossed the line, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. "You ever think about coming back?" Reynolds asked suddenly. Arnold smirked. "You asked me that already." "I know," Reynolds said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But I mean it. Not as a cop, maybe not even as part of the system. But you've got something people respect. You don't have to throw a punch to win a fight." Arnold glanced down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly. He had spent decades using his strength, his skill, his presence to command attention. But the truth was, it wasn't the force that made him formidable. It was the understanding of when to use it, and more importantly, when not to. "I think my fighting days are behind me," Arnold said. "At least the kind you're talking about." Reynolds studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The golden light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. Finally, Reynolds stood up, brushing off his uniform. "Take care of yourself, Arnold." Arnold tipped his head slightly. "You too." Reynolds turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of park visitors. Arnold watched him go, then leaned back once more, his fingers idly tapping against the armrest of the bench. The pigeons hadn't left. They never did. And so, with a small smile playing at the corner of his lips, Arnold reached into his pocket, grabbed another handful of birdseed, and scattered it at his feet. The world kept moving, but for now, this moment was enough. The sun dipped lower into the horizon, casting long shadows across Griffith Park. The heat of the afternoon had mellowed into a comfortable warmth, and the once crowded pathways now held fewer joggers, strollers, and dog walkers. Arnold Schwarzenegger remained on his bench, unmoved by the passing of time, the scattered birdseed at his feet nearly gone as the pigeons pecked greedily. Despite the calm that had returned to the park, the echoes of the earlier confrontation lingered in the back of his mind. The encounter with Officer Dan Cross had been inevitable. Men like Cross were everywhere, authority figures who mistook power for respect, who let their need for control cloud their judgment. Arnold had dealt with them in every stage of his life, from bodybuilding to Hollywood to politics. And while the names and faces changed, the type remained the same. As the last few pigeons fluttered away, Arnold stood up, stretching his broad shoulders. He had no particular place to be, but the world always had a way of pulling him into something. Just as he took his first step away from the bench, a voice behind him called out, "You never really liked to stay quiet, did you?" Arnold turned to see an older man standing a few feet away, dressed in plain slacks and a button-up shirt, his thinning hair combed back neatly. He recognized the face instantly. Richard Mallory, an old friend from his time in Sacramento, a former police commissioner with more political savvy than most elected officials. "And you never liked staying out of trouble," Arnold countered with a smirk. Mallory chuckled as he approached, his hands resting in his pockets. "Word travels fast. You made quite the spectacle today. Even off-duty officers were talking about it." Arnold crossed his arms. "Did I, or did someone else make a mistake they couldn't take back?" Mallory sighed, tilting his head in agreement. Cross was always a hothead. He was on borrowed time, and today was just the final nail in the coffin. Still, you have to know that an incident like this doesn't just disappear. There are questions being asked, people looking for answers. Arnold shrugged. "Let them ask. The truth doesn't need explanations." Mallory studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's exactly why I wanted to find you. The department needs help cleaning up its reputation after this. There are good men on the force, men who want to do the right thing, but are being drowned out by the bad ones. You could help." Arnold scoffed, shaking his head. "You know me better than that, Richard. I don't play politics anymore. This isn't politics. It's leadership. You still believe in doing what's right, don't you?" Arnold looked past Mallory, his eyes scanning the park, watching the fading sunlight reflect off the city beyond. He did believe in doing the right thing, but he had spent a lifetime fighting battles, some won, some lost. He wasn't sure if he had another one left in him. Mallory sighed, sensing his hesitation. "At least think about it. The world still listens when you speak, Arnold. That's a rare thing." With that, he extended a hand. Arnold clasped it firmly, a silent acknowledgement of old battles fought together, of respect earned over decades. Mallory gave him one last look before turning and walking away, his silhouette fading into the growing dusk. Arnold remained standing for a while, his mind racing despite his body remaining still. Perhaps there was one more fight worth stepping into. Not with fists or force, but with the same presence that had turned him from an immigrant bodybuilder into one of the most influential figures in the world. The park lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the winding pathways. Arnold exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Maybe it was time to speak again. Maybe it was time to remind the world what real strength looked like.